The stagecoach rolled into the dusty town of Sagebrush Hollow, just as the sun dipped behind the far hills, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rust. Clara Bennett stepped down carefully, clutching a worn satchel in one hand and a folded letter in the other. Her gloves were thin, her dress simple but neatly mended, and though she carried little, her heart brimmed with quiet hope. The letter, creased and smudged from days of travel, was her promise of a new beginning. It bore the signature of Grant McCord, a widowed rancher seeking a wife through the mail-order service. Clara had answered his ad not out of desperation, but determination. Back east, she'd spent her youth working in a stable, breaking colts and tending horses for men who never looked her way except to issue orders. When her last employer's wife accused her of impropriety for merely speaking to a ranch hand, she lost both her job and her reputation. Marriage, she thought, might offer her something she'd never had, a home where she could belong, and a husband who saw her as an equal partner. But as she stepped into the ranch yard hours later, her heart sank. The McCord Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, fences stretching into the distance, corrals filled with snorting horses, barns humming with life. Yet the air felt cold, no laughter, no warmth, only the low rumble of hooves and the whistle of wind through the grass. The men working there looked up as she arrived, some with pity, others with smirks. One muttered, another one come to try her luck before spitting into the dust. Then she saw him, Grant McCord, standing by the corral fence, tall and broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing sharp blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. He was older than she'd expected, perhaps mid-30s, with a hard, weathered face that carried both strength and sorrow. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing the tan lines of a man who worked with his hands. But there was something about his stillness, his distance, that unsettled her. When their eyes met, he didn't smile. Instead, he looked her over like a man inspecting a new horse. Calm, assessing, silent. "You're Miss Bennett?" he asked finally, voice low and steady. "Yes, sir," she answered, forcing steadiness into her tone. "Clara Bennett." "You're Mr. McCord?" He gave a single nod. "Grant'll do. You've come a long way." She waited for a kind word, a gesture of welcome, but none came. Instead, he turned and motioned for her to follow him to the big ranch house. Inside, the air smelled faintly of smoke and leather, but the home felt empty, like it hadn't seen laughter in years. A single photograph rested on the mantel, a woman holding a foal, both smiling. He noticed her glance and said quietly, "My late wife." Then, almost brusquely, "I didn't bring you here for sentiment. I need someone who can handle this life. The ranch, the storms, the stock. It's not easy, and I won't coddle you." Clara stiffened. "I didn't come to be coddled." Grant's gaze sharpened slightly, a flicker of something, respect maybe, passing through his eyes. "Good," he said. Then, after a long pause, he added, "You said in your letter you were good with horses. Let's see if you can back that up. I've got a stallion, wild as they come. No man's been able to break him. You can't marry a rancher if you can't handle his land. So here's my offer. Train my wild stallion and the ranch is yours." The words struck her like a challenge and a warning. The ranch hands outside murmured in disbelief. No one had managed to tame that horse, but Clara lifted her chin, meeting his gaze head-on. "Then I accept," she said softly, though her heart pounded in her chest. That night, long after the lanterns went dark, Clara lay awake in the guest room, listening to the restless wind and the echo of her own doubts. She had wanted a marriage. What she'd been given was a test of courage, of heart, and perhaps of love itself. And in that test, she knew, her future hung by the reins of a wild stallion named Ghostfire. Morning came sharp and bright, the air still cool from the night before. A thin mist clung to the valley floor as the sun rose over the ridges, spilling gold across the McCord Ranch. Clara Bennett tied her hair back with a strip of ribbon, pulled on her worn gloves, and stepped out into the yard. The ranch hands were already at work, pitching hay, mending fences, calling to one another in rough voices. When they saw her heading toward the corral, silence rippled through them. "There she goes," one of them muttered, half grinning. "Let's see how long this one lasts." Another man, older and kinder, shook his head. "Poor girl. Ghostfire'll tear her apart." Clara ignored them, her heart pounding but her chin held high. If they thought she'd scare easily, they were wrong. She'd faced worse than the sneers of cowhands. She was here to prove herself, to Grant, to them, and to the part of herself that still doubted she belonged anywhere at all. The stallion's corral stood at the far end of the property, apart from the others. The fence was tall and double-barred, the gate chained twice over. Inside, the wild stallion stood like a creature carved from smoke and moonlight, sleek silver gray with a black mane that whipped in the wind. His name, she'd learned, was Ghostfire, and it fit him perfectly. His muscles rippled beneath his coat, his eyes bright and wary. The moment she stepped closer, his ears went back and he snorted, pawing the ground in warning. From the fence line, Grant McCord watched in silence. He didn't call out, didn't offer advice or comfort. He simply stood there, arms crossed, hat tilted low, observing every move she made. Clara drew a slow breath and approached the fence, careful and calm. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice soft and steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." Ghostfire's head tossed high, nostrils flaring. He paced, muscles tight with mistrust. Clara stayed outside the corral, lowering her gaze so as not to challenge him. She knew his kind, spirited, intelligent, wounded. Somewhere someone had broken his trust once, and he hadn't forgotten. For hours she stayed nearby, saying little, simply letting him get used to her presence. She spoke in low tones, not of commands but of comfort, words that held no meaning to him, only rhythm. The wind tugged her hair loose, the dust clung to her skirts, but she didn't move away. Finally, Ghostfire stopped pacing. He stood still, watching her with one dark, cautious eye. "That's it," she murmured, smiling faintly. "See? I'm not the enemy." From the corner of her eye, she saw Grant turn away and walk off, his boots crunching over gravel. He hadn't expected her to last that long. That was fine. She didn't need his belief, just time. That evening, while the men gathered in the bunkhouse, she stayed by the corral again, feeding Ghostfire slices of apple through the fence. He didn't take them at first. Then, with a quick, cautious motion, he snatched one and stepped back. Clara's heart lifted like a bird taking flight. It wasn't victory, but it was a beginning. Later, as the sun bled into the hills, Grant returned. His face was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that wasn't cold. "You've got more patience than most men I've hired," he said quietly. Clara wiped her hands on her skirt. "You don't break a horse like him by force, Mr. McCord. You earn his trust." Grant's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close. "That's a dangerous way to think out here." "Maybe," she said, "but so is giving up before you've even tried." He studied her for a long moment before tipping his hat. "We'll see how long that patience lasts." As he walked away, Clara turned back to Ghostfire, the stallion's eyes reflecting the last fire of daylight. They were both alone, both scarred, both waiting for someone to believe they could be more than what the world had made them. And in that quiet hour between day and night, she made a silent vow. She would tame the wild stallion. And maybe, just maybe, the man who dared her to try. The next few days bled together in sweat, dust, and quiet determination. Clara woke before dawn and worked long past sunset, spending every spare moment near Ghostfire's corral. The stallion was unpredictable, sometimes calm and curious, sometimes wild as the wind. He let her come close 1 hour only to lash out the next. But each small victory, a soft snort, a still moment, a trusting glance, was enough to keep her trying. Still, not everyone shared her faith. The ranch hands watched from afar, shaking their heads. "That woman's gonna get herself killed," one said. McCord should have stopped this foolishness, but Grant McCord didn't stop her. Every morning he appeared by the fence, silent, arms crossed, that unreadable look in his eyes. He gave no praise, no criticism, just watched. And though he'd never admit it aloud, Clara's calm persistence stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Respect. It was late afternoon on the 5th day when it happened. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the corral. Clara had finally managed to slip inside the fence, moving slow, deliberate, careful not to startle Ghostfire. He snorted, muscles twitching, but didn't bolt. She held out her hand, palm open, an apple slice resting in her glove. "That's it, boy," she murmured. "Easy now. It's just me." The stallion's ears flicked forward, then back. For a moment he hesitated, then stepped closer. Clara's breath caught inches. He was only inches away. She could almost touch his muzzle, and then a shout. One of the younger ranch hands, trying to impress the others, banged a feed bucket against the fence. The sudden clang split the air. Ghostfire reared with a scream, hooves flashing. Clara stumbled backward as dirt and dust exploded around her. The stallion's massive body surged past her, nearly striking her shoulder. Grant was through the gate in seconds, grabbing her arm and pulling her out of the corral just as Ghostfire kicked out. The force rattled the fence boards, the stallion's eyes wild with fear. "What were you thinking?" Grant's voice was raw, thunder in every word. "You could have been killed." Clara jerked her arm free, breathing hard. "It wasn't me who scared him." "That doesn't matter. You were inside that pen without backup, without sense. You think you can tame a beast like that alone?" "I wasn't alone," she snapped, anger flaring to match his. "I was with him. You don't break a horse with brute strength, Mr. McCord. You listen. You understand?" Grant's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with something fierce and pained. "Understanding doesn't save you from getting trampled under 1,000 pounds of muscle, Miss Bennett." She met his stare without flinching. "Neither does shutting yourself off from everything you care about." The words hit harder than she intended. Silence fell. Ghostfire snorted behind them, pacing in tight, furious circles. The ranch hands had gone quiet, watching from a distance. Grant turned away first, his voice low. "This isn't a game, Clara. That stallion's broken bones before. He doesn't trust anyone, and he never will. Maybe because no one's ever trusted him first," she said softly. Grant stopped, but didn't look back. His shoulders stiffened, his hand tightening briefly on the fence rail. Then he walked off toward the house, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding and the taste of dust and defiance in her mouth. As the sun sank beyond the hills, Clara leaned against the fence, her fingers trembling. Ghostfire had nearly crushed her, yes, but the real danger wasn't just in the horse's hooves. It was in the man whose pain and pride loomed larger than any animal's. She knew then that this challenge was no longer about earning a ranch. It was about breaking through walls, his, hers, and the invisible one standing between them, and she had no intention of backing down. The next morning, the air on the ranch was thick with silence. Clara rose before dawn as always, but the usual greetings from the ranch hands were absent. The men avoided her eyes, half out of pity, half out of fear that she might actually continue after yesterday's near tragedy. She could still feel the ghost of Grant's grip on her arm, the heat of his anger and the tremor in his voice when he'd shouted her name. But she also remembered the flicker beneath that anger. Fear. Not just for her safety, but for something deeper, something that haunted him. She walked toward the corral, Ghostfire pacing within. The stallion had calmed overnight, but his eyes still flashed with wildness, his breath steaming in the cold air. Clara leaned on the fence, speaking softly as she always did. "You're not the only one with ghosts, are you, boy?" she murmured. "He's got them too." Later that afternoon, while helping tidy the house, Clara found herself drawn to the sitting room, the only part of the big home that seemed to carry life. Dust lay thick on the shelves, but the mantel was carefully kept. There, beside a small vase of dried flowers, stood a faded photograph. A woman, smiling, bright-eyed, wearing a riding dress, stood beside a young foal. Grant McCord's arm was around her shoulders. Behind them, the same rolling hills of the ranch stretched into the distance. But what caught Clara's breath was the foal itself. Its coat, silver gray with a black mane and dark eyes, was unmistakable. Ghostfire. Her hands trembled as she set the photo down. Suddenly, so much made sense. The fear in Grant's eyes when she entered the corral. The bitterness in his tone whenever Ghostfire was mentioned. The stallion wasn't just an animal to him. He was a memory, a living reminder of loss. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Grant stood in the doorway, his gaze fixed on her, unreadable. "You shouldn't be in here," he said quietly. "I was cleaning," she replied, steadying her voice. "I didn't mean to pry." His eyes flicked to the photograph, then back to her. "You saw?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. She was beautiful. Grant's jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he'd order her out. But instead he crossed the room and took the photograph in his hands. "Her name was Lydia," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "She was everything this place had, everything I had. What happened?" Clara asked gently. He didn't answer right away. His thumb brushed the glass of the frame. "There was a storm," he said finally. "Lightning spooked the herd. Lydia went out to calm them. Ghostfire was just a colt then, wild even as a baby. He bolted and she—" He stopped, breath catching. "She fell. Broke her neck before I could reach her." Silence filled the room, heavy and raw. Clara swallowed hard. "You blamed the stallion." "I blamed myself." His voice cracked slightly, the mask he wore every day slipping for just a moment. And when I couldn't bear that, I blamed him. I told myself if I could tame him, I could make it right somehow. Her eyes softened. And you never could. He looked at her, pain etched deep into every line of his face. No, I never could. He's her ghost, Miss Bennet. Every time I see him, I see her dying all over again. Clara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Maybe he's not her ghost. Maybe he's her gift. Maybe she left you something to finish, something to heal. Grant stared at her for a long time, something shifting behind his guarded eyes. Then he turned away abruptly. You should stay away from that horse, he muttered. He's more dangerous than you think. But as he left the room, Clara looked again at the photograph and felt the truth settle deep in her chest. This challenge had never been about proving herself. It was about helping two broken souls find peace, and she wasn't about to give up on either of them. The storm rolled in fast from the mountains, a wall of black clouds swallowing the sky. By the time the first crack of thunder split the air, the ranch was already in chaos. Horses whinnying, cattle lowing, men shouting to drive the stock into shelter. Rain lashed down in heavy sheets, turning the ground to mud. Clara was in the barn when she heard it, a sound sharper than thunder, raw and terrible. Ghost fire. The stallion's scream cut through the storm like a blade. She dropped the saddle she'd been holding and ran. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the corral. The gate was swinging wildly on its hinges, one chain broken loose. Ghostfire reared and kicked, trapped in panic, his eyes rolling white. The wind tore at his mane, and each thunderclap sent him into another frenzy. He could hurt himself, break a leg, or worse if someone didn't calm him. Clara, get back, a ranch hand shouted. He'll kill you if you go in there. But she barely heard him. Her heart pounded, her mind clear. She'd seen that look in Ghostfire's eyes before, fear, not fury. He didn't need to be forced. He needed someone to believe in him. She pushed through the gate, rain soaking her to the skin, mud splashing up her skirts. Easy, boy, she called, her voice steady despite the storm. I'm here. You're all right. The stallion wheeled on her, nostrils flared, his great body shivering with tension. His hooves struck the earth inches from her, and the ground trembled. But Clara didn't move. She lifted her hands slowly, palms open. It's just me, she whispered. I'm not leaving you. Ghostfire's ears flicked toward her. His breathing slowed just a little. Lightning flashed again and he flinched. But she didn't. She stepped closer, one careful step at a time, her boots sinking into the muck. I know you're scared, she murmured. So am I. But we're going to be fine. For a long moment, the storm drowned everything. The roar of wind, the drum of rain, the distant shouting of men. Then in the quiet between thunderclaps, Ghostfire stopped moving. His sides heaved. His head dropped slightly and his wild gaze softened. Clara reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the wet curve of his muzzle. The stallion snorted once but didn't pull away. She stroked him gently, speaking to him as if to an old friend. There you go. That's it, beautiful boy. You're safe. When the lightning flashed again, the sight was almost unreal. Woman and horse standing together in the rain, motionless, trusting. Grant McCord had been fighting through the storm to secure the cattle when he saw them. For a heartbeat, he thought the lightning had played a trick on his eyes. Clara, small, soaked, stubborn Clara, standing calm before the stallion no man had ever tamed. He ran to the corral, shouting over the wind, Clara, get out of there! But when he saw Ghostfire lower his head into her hands, something in him stopped. The fear, the guilt, the anger all fell silent. The storm inside him broke as surely as the one raging overhead. By the time the rain eased, Ghostfire was standing quietly beside her, trembling but calm. Clara leaned against his shoulder, exhausted, her hair plastered to her face. Grant stepped forward, awe written across his face. I thought, he began but couldn't finish. Clara turned, a faint smile trembling on her lips. You thought wrong. He met her gaze, eyes full of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Together, they led the stallion back to the barn, where the warm lamplight cut through the storm's fading shadow. For the first time since Lydia's death, Ghostfire stood still under a man's hand, and for the first time, Grant McCord realized that maybe not everything lost had to stay broken. The morning after the storm, the valley lay washed clean, glistening beneath the first light of dawn. The air smelled of rain and sagebrush, the world quiet except for the distant drip of water from the barn roof. Inside, Clara stood brushing Ghostfire's coat, her movements slow and rhythmic. The stallion stood still, ears relaxed, eyes calm, his trust now fragile but real. Every so often he turned his head and nudged her shoulder gently, as if reminding her he was still there. Grant McCord stood in the doorway, hat in hand, watching. His chest felt tight, his mind unable to reconcile what he was seeing. No one, not a single man in all his years, had been able to calm that horse. But Clara Bennett, a mail-order bride with a soft voice and stubborn courage, had done it in the middle of a thunderstorm. When she noticed him, she didn't speak at first. She just kept brushing, her expression peaceful. Finally, she said quietly, "He's not wild anymore. Just misunderstood." Grant stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the straw. "You shouldn't have gone in there last night," he said. "You could have been killed." Clara smiled faintly without looking at him. "I know, but I didn't die. Neither did he. Sometimes that's enough." He let out a slow breath. "You don't know how close you came. I saw what happened to Lydia. I thought I was watching it again." That name hung between them, heavy as thunder. Clara turned, meeting his gaze. "You loved her very much." Grant nodded once, his throat tightening. "She was the best part of me. And when she died, I buried the rest with her." Clara set down the brush and walked toward him, stopping just a few feet away. Her voice was soft but steady. "You didn't bury it, Grant, you just locked it away. You think guilt honors her memory, but all it's done is chain you to pain. Ghostfire didn't kill her. The storm did. And storms?" She paused, her eyes searching his. "They pass." He stared at her, words lost somewhere in his chest. She was right, and he hated how much it hurt to admit it. He turned away, running a hand through his damp hair. "You talk like healing's that simple," Clara smiled sadly. "It isn't, but it's possible." They stood in silence for a long time, the morning light stretching across the barn floor. Then quietly she reached out and touched his arm. The warmth of her hand startled him. It was the first human touch he'd felt in years that didn't come with pity or condolence. It felt alive. "Grant," she said softly, "you don't have to face this alone anymore." He looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then into her eyes. The steel that had always guarded him seemed to falter. In that moment, something within him shifted, like a door creaking open after years of rust. "You've done more than tame a horse," he said quietly. "You've tamed the ghost that's been riding me since that night." Her smile deepened, gentle and true. "I didn't tame it," she whispered. "You just stopped fighting it." For the first time in years, Grant McCord smiled, a real smile, soft and almost boyish. He reached out and brushed a strand of wet hair from her face. "You're something else, Miss Bennett." "Clara," she corrected with a spark in her eyes. "Clara," he repeated, as though tasting the word for the first time. Ghostfire snorted behind them, as if claiming his own place in their fragile truce. Grant chuckled, shaking his head. "Seems he approves." Clara laughed softly. "That makes two of you finally learning to trust." Grant's gaze lingered on her, longer, deeper, until the air between them hummed with something unspoken. He wanted to say more, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he tipped his hat slightly and said, "Breakfast will be ready soon." As he left the barn, Clara leaned her head against Ghostfire's shoulder, her heart pounding. She knew the walls between them were starting to crack, and once they did, there would be no turning back. The days that followed felt different, softer somehow. The tension that had always filled the ranch air like an unspoken storm began to ease. Grant McCord wasn't the same man who had first offered Clara that impossible challenge. His voice had gentled, his temper cooled, and his eyes, once dark and shuttered, seemed to find light again every time they met hers. Clara noticed it all. She saw how he lingered at the corral fence longer than before, watching her work Ghostfire, how he'd sometimes join her, offering to carry the feed or fix the gate latch, pretending it was nothing. But she knew better. He was trying to understand the woman who had walked into his life and changed everything. Ghostfire's transformation mirrored his own. The stallion, once wild and reckless, now followed Clara's soft whistle, moving with grace and trust. Watching them together stirred something deep in Grant's chest, a pride he hadn't felt in years mixed with a quiet fear. Because the closer Clara came to taming the horse, the closer came the end of her bargain. And possibly, her departure. One afternoon, Clara led Ghostfire out into the open pasture. The sun hung low, turning the grass to gold. Grant followed, leaning against the fence as she mounted bareback for the first time. "Careful," he warned, his voice low. She smiled down at him. "Trust, remember?" He didn't reply, just clenched his jaw and watched. With a light nudge of her heel, Ghostfire started forward, his stride powerful yet controlled. Clara's hair whipped in the breeze, her laughter carried on the wind. It was a sight that stole Grant's breath. The woman and the horse, both once broken by life, now whole and free. When she dismounted, he was already waiting. "You did it," he said quietly. Clara brushed a strand of hair from her face, smiling up at him. "No, we did it." He looked at her for a long moment before replying. "That means the deal's done. The ranch is yours, Clara." Her smile faltered. "You mean you're giving it up?" "A deal's a deal," he said, but his voice wasn't steady. "You earned it fair." Clara shook her head. "That's not what I came here for," he frowned. "You said you wanted a marriage. I thought this was your way out. A chance to build a life of your own." "I wanted a marriage built on heart, not land," she said softly. "You think I worked this hard because I wanted your ranch?" "No, Grant. I did it because I wanted to see you live again." Grant stared at her, his throat tightening. "Clara." She took a step closer. "You don't have to give me anything. Not the ranch. Not the horse. Not even your name." Her voice trembled slightly. "Just don't shut me out anymore." He swallowed hard, his heart pounding. Every wall he'd built was gone now, standing before her with nothing left but truth. "You said storms pass," he murmured. "I didn't believe it. Until you." A faint smile curved her lips. "Then believe it now." He reached out, his rough hand brushing hers. "Stay," he said hoarsely. "Not because of a promise or pity or some deal. Stay because you want to." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "I already decided that days ago." The world seemed to still around them, the wind, the horses, the endless sky, all holding its breath as their eyes met. Then Grant leaned down, slowly, carefully, and kissed her. It wasn't the desperate kind of kiss that came from loneliness, but a quiet one. Steady, real, the start of something new. When they finally pulled apart, Clara whispered, "Does this mean the deal's changed?" Grant smiled for the first time without sadness in his eyes. "Yeah," he said softly. "Now it's a partnership." Ghostfire snorted nearby, pawing the dirt as if approving the arrangement. Clara laughed, leaning against Grant's chest as the sun dipped lower behind them. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel haunted. It felt like home. Winter crept quietly into the valley, frosting the fields with silver and softening the horizon. The ranch, once filled with loneliness and echoes of loss, now pulsed with new life. Smoke curled from the chimney, laughter spilled from the kitchen, and the sound of horses nickering in the stables mixed with the faint hum of contentment that seemed to hang in the air. Clara, McCord, she still wasn't used to hearing her name that way, stepped out onto the porch one crisp morning, cradling a mug of coffee between her hands. The mountains stood solemn and snow-capped in the distance, their peaks glowing pink under the rising sun. Down by the corral, Grant worked alongside the ranch hands, his deep voice calling orders, his laughter, once so rare, rolling across the yard like music. It had been 3 months since that day in the pasture, when he'd asked her to stay. 3 months since Ghostfire had finally let her ride him under the open sky, and in that short span everything had changed. She walked toward the corral, her breath puffing in small clouds. Ghostfire lifted his head as she approached, nickering softly before trotting toward her. Clara smiled, stroking his nose. "You remember, don't you?" she whispered. "You were as stubborn as he was." Grant came up behind her, his gloved hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "And look at us now," he said with a small smile. "Guess neither of us turned out too wild after all." Clara turned, teasing. "Speak for yourself." He chuckled, slipping an arm around her waist. "I stand corrected." The morning stretched on peacefully. Together they tended the horses, fixed fences, and planned for spring. There was no longer the heavy silence between them, just the easy rhythm of partnership. They spoke of expanding the herd, of teaching children to ride from nearby towns, of turning the ranch into something more than a place of work, a place that gave others the kind of peace they'd fought for. As the day warmed, Clara found herself watching Grant more than once. He wasn't the same man she'd met that first day, the one wrapped in grief and anger. He smiled now, genuinely. He looked at her like she was the one thing in his world that made sense. And every time his eyes met hers, she felt the same quiet certainty she'd felt that night in the barn. They'd both been saved by something wilder and deeper than they'd ever expected. Trust. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the land, Clara sat on the porch sewing a small blanket. Grant stepped out, drying his hands on a towel. "You've been busy," he said, nodding toward her lap. She smiled faintly. "Thought the new addition to the ranch might need it come spring." Grant froze. "New addition?" Clara looked up, eyes gleaming. "Guess I should have told you sooner. We'll need a crib, too." For a moment, he just stared, his tough exterior breaking in an instant. Then his eyes softened, and he knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he rested it over hers. "Clara." His voice cracked. "You mean it?" She nodded, tears brimming. "We're building something new, Grant. Not just the ranch. A family." He took her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and tender, his forehead resting against hers when they broke apart. "I never thought I'd get another chance at this," he whispered. "You didn't," she said softly. "You made one." The sun slipped behind the hills, leaving the ranch bathed in twilight. Ghostfire whinnied in the distance, his voice echoing through the quiet. Grant wrapped his arm around her shoulders as they looked out across the land they'd fought for, healed on, and built together. "You know," he said, his tone teasing, "I still think I got the better end of that deal." Clara laughed, leaning into him. "Oh, I know you did." And as the stars bloomed overhead, the once lonely ranch stood alive again, no longer haunted by loss, but glowing with love, promise, and the future they'd built together.